Welcome everyone to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium for the 4th of February, 2022. We are excited to have you here, and we're very excited about the presentation today by Dr. Dai. We begin the UIC events with the Msu Land Acknowledgement. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. If you're interested in land acknowledgements in general or in Michigan State's land acknowledgement in particular, I will put a couple of links in the chat when I'm done with the introduction. For those of you who are new to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, it is a forum organized by the Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinarity and sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters that highlights the innovative and important interdisciplinary work conducted by artists and humanists at Michigan State University. Interdisciplinarity often is a term that is used to talk about complex science. That's often how research universities like MSU conceive of it. And what gets lost is the fact that some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work, in our view, reflects an appreciation for aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of human experience, broadly construed. So the UIC is an attempt really to amplify and acknowledge the interdisciplinary contributions that feature our aesthetic and humanistic elements. We meet every other week. So we meeting today, we'll meet in 2 weeks at this time. On all of the UICs are on Zoom. After Dr. Yuanfang Dai presents, there will be a question and answer period. What we would invite you to do is to deposit your questions or your comments in the chat or use the Zoom Q&A function as you have them. So please, don't hesitate to put a question in the chat. And then when Dr. Dai is finished with her remarks, I'll read the questions and the comments in the order that they arrived. So that's the Q&A period. So we're recording the session, so I'll go ahead and read out the comments that you introduce into the chat. As I mentioned, we meet every other week. We'll meet again in 2 weeks on the 18th of February, 12 to 1, following the link that you followed today on Zoom. Our speaker will be Dr. Stephen D. Benedetto, the professor and chair of a professor and the chair of the Department of Theater at Michigan State, who will give a talk entitled "Who Owns a Cultural Heritage Site? Experiments with Digital Technologies and Immersive Performance as Preservation." So that's in 2 weeks. Today, though, as I mentioned, we have with us Dr. Yuanfang Dai. Dr. Dai is an assistant professor at the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures at Michigan State. She's also a faculty fellow and affiliate faculty at Michigan State University's Center for Gender and Global Context, and an affiliate faculty member with the Center for Interdisciplinarity. She received her PhD in philosophy from Michigan State, go green, and she also has a PhD in philosophy from Peking University in China. Her research areas include feminist philosophy, social and political philosophy, ethics, and critical cultural studies. She has a special interest in gendered identity, cultural dynamics, transcultural experiences, and feminist solidarity across cultural differences. She is author of Transcultural Feminist Philosophy, Rethinking Difference and Solidarity Through Chinese-American Encounters. She's currently writing a monograph in which she explores pathways of the intellectual development of Chinese feminisms. And today, Dr. Dai is with us to discuss this new book project in a talk entitled "Chinese Feminist Philosophy, Theorizing Chinese Feminism in Transcultural Contexts." Dr. Dai.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And also many thanks to everybody who is here today for this talk. I appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen. While I was finishing up my last book, which was titled Transcultural Feminist Philosophy, towards the end of the book, I was working on a few chapters on Chinese feminisms. I was asking myself, how much do I know about Chinese feminism? Turns out I didn't know much about it. That became the motivation for this book. Because I wanted to learn more about Chinese women and Chinese feminisms. My current book project, Chinese Feminist Philosophy in Transcultural Context, is a philosophical reflection of the Chinese feminist scholarship generated from the mid-1990s to the present. A significant point of reference is that in 1992, China further shifted toward a market economic system, which has greatly influenced pathways and the development of Chinese feminist scholarship. I argue that the intellectual development of Chinese feminist scholarship in the past 3 decades is significantly influenced by US-oriented global feminism and international feminism. But at the same time, Chinese feminist scholarship evolves through its reflections on the complicated relationship between the global influences and the local Chinese feminisms. I use the transcultural approach as a methodology to observe the interplay of Chinese feminisms and the US-oriented internationalization of feminisms. Pathways of Chinese feminist scholarship also demonstrate a transcultural trend. This is the structure of my presentation today. I start with the historical context and the transnational context. Then I go on to talk about feminist NGO practices, more like activist practices, and the feminist scholarship on gender, which is more like theoretical trend. Then I go on to talk about the socialist legacies and cultural heritages. There's so many moving pieces in the Chinese feminism because in the past 3 decades, there's so much going on. And then I end the presentation with the diversity of Chinese feminisms. So a really brief historical overview of Chinese feminism prior to the 1990s. Western feminism first entered China in the end of the 19th century, and this phase ended in the anti-Japanese war in the 1930s. In this presentation or in my writing, I try to kind of use a lowercase for Western because I don't personally believe there's a kind of a clear distinction between East and West. So from now on, I'll probably just use lowercase for Western. Educated Chinese men and women actively deployed ideologies from the West in the pursuit of national salvation and self-emancipation. Feminism was embraced by men as instrumental to China's modernity and by women as pointing to a new way of life. After 1949, as part of a socialist feminist movement, state feminism moved forward Chinese women liberation movement. State feminism originally refers to feminism done by feminists employed as bureaucrats in positions of power or female politicians promoting gender equality policies in Europe. When applied to China, state feminism often portrays a paradoxical image of state patriarchy championing women's liberation, although with vacillation and inconsistency. Some scholars argue that a hidden history of a socialist state feminist maneuvering behind the scenes. These women worked to advance gender and class equality in the early People's Republic and fought to transform sexist norm and practices, while facing opposition from a male-dominated government and leadership. Viewed by many Western feminists during the late 1960s and early 1970s as the only successful revolutionary force that brought gender equality to a traditional society, socialist revolution in China was reviewed in the 1980s as fundamentally patriarchal, a betrayal of its own previous feminist promise and against women's interests. The result of the contentions over knowledge production about socialism, along with the dominance of neoliberal global capitalism and capitalist consumption, the memory of women's liberation in Chinese Revolution was claimed to be erased during Chinese transition of discourse to a market-oriented one in the 1990s. This left space for Western feminist theories to come in and dominate. As intellectual resistance, some Chinese feminists are passionate about building Chinese feminism of its own. The women's studies movement in the 1980s shows efforts of indigenous Chinese women's studies. The women's studies movement starting in the 1980s originated from Marxist feminism, but it looked at women as subjects and emphasized the femininity of women, because in the revolutionary years, women were considered like iron women, iron girls, like as equal as men. But that concept could be backfired. As a discipline, women's studies in China was developed as an integral part of the Chinese socialist movement, rather than being an outgrowth of the women's movement as in the West. So this is a part of this transnational context. Chinese women end neoliberal global capitalism. Neoliberalism is usually associated with the free market capitalism that was promoted in the 1980s and 1990s by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Since the 1980s, the Chinese government orchestrated neoliberal-looking market-oriented economic reforms. China's economic reform started from around 1980 when it joined the World Bank and IMF, and the reforms encompassed many measures of free market capitalism. Some scholars claim that neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics best describes China's particular kind of a market economy that increasingly incorporates neoliberal elements with authoritarian centralized control. Under the rubric of neoliberalism or neoliberal global capitalism as a social, economic, political mechanism, previously underdeveloped countries are forced to the dictates of international investors through structural adjustment programs, SAPs for short. Some feminists praise political agency of capitalism and neoliberalism for empowering women, but others claim that the burdens of SAPs are disproportionately borne by women, and hegemonic feminisms are in a dangerous liaison with the global capitalism. The development of Chinese feminism is to a large extent impacted by government policies, and the government policies are to a large extent impacted by the economic development. In the 1990s, when China transited from a planned economy to a market economy, many economic entities were privatized. And as a result, a large number of women workers were laid off and lost benefits. Many of these women had a hard time finding re-employment, and their families became the urban poor. The global division of women's gender labor provides a context for feminist discussions of Chinese women's labor in neoliberal global capitalist economy. The vulnerability of Chinese women's gendered labor is noticeable in the global division of labor, and some scholars claim that neoliberalism works as a logic of governing that migrates from the West to the rest of the world, including China. And I think all of us, to a certain extent, benefit from this global market and work by women in developing countries such as China, as a lot of our household goods and items made in China. Another aspect of this transnational context for the rise of the current configuration of Chinese feminist practices is internationalization of feminism, and couple trends of this internationalization of feminism, to be exact. Two feminist trends are central in the discussion of internationalization of feminism. The first trend is claimed to increasingly overlap with the imperialist project of the powerful states in the West in their benevolence to bring international women to the civilized world and save them from their patriarchal communities and cultures. The second trend is critical of the first one, engaging the political economic forces of colonial modernity and its past neo-colonial formations, including capitalism and in particular relations of exploitation based on gender relations. The first trend is called global feminism, international feminism, while the second trend is called transnational feminism. What we see, like in most, like a lot of publications, probably global feminism, international feminism. The mainstream assumption about internationalization of feminism is that it is the spread of feminist knowledge that is produced in the West and consumed in various parts of the world. What is dominant in internationalization of feminism in the 1990s is neoliberal global capitalism and international feminism. The rise of the transnational feminism is to resist global capitalism and neoliberalism. In the assumed tension between women of color feminisms and transnational feminism, which is race versus transnationality, the impact of globalization in US feminism, which is spreading US feminism to the world, but seldom the other way around, is overlooked, this impact of globalization in US feminism, which makes US feminism is a paradigm. How the paradigm of US-oriented transnational feminism shapes the ways in which we produce, consume, and disseminate knowledge about women in the world is an issue of power and knowledge. Discussions of global feminism, international feminism, and local feminisms typically have the United States as their reference point, treating the US as the center of global feminism and international feminism, while others as local or peripheral feminisms reflects a power dynamic in which feminisms in quote-unquote other nation states are rendered as quote-unquote local feminisms, while US feminism is rarely considered in its particularity, nor as local feminisms. Various efforts of transnational feminist activism are made to connect local feminisms and the US-oriented global feminisms, and forge transnational feminist solidarity in which transnational cooperation and collaboration is visible. Changes in China and the influence of neoliberal global capitalism not only result in a consumer culture, but also indicate a feminist discourse shift from a collective social movement to individual women's struggles and empowerment. Cycles of gender vulnerability now operate on a transnational as well as national scale. Consequently, resisting implementation of women in multinational capitalism requires transnational feminist solidarity. Both transnational feminism and transcultural feminism, which I propose in my writing project, question ethnocentrism and promote solidarity across national border but transcultural feminism focuses more on interference of cultures. Transcultural is key idea for thinking about Chinese history more generally, as transculturalism offers a promising way of mediating the assumed tension between differences among women and the common cause of feminist solidarity. The transcultural approach is the pivotal idea, particularly as it bears on thinking about Chinese feminism. A transcultural approach can best grasp the key claim I make about Chinese feminism and Western institutions. About Chinese feminism, though influenced in various ways by Western feminism and Western institutions, the evolving forms of feminist practice in China are by no means external import, but rather aspects of a process that is distinctly Chinese, because there are many concepts like from Western feminist theories are considered as import, like in the past 2 or 3 decades, like China imported a lot of material goods like Nike shoes, McDonald's, KFC, etc. These Western feminist theories were considered as import as well, theoretical imports. So then we kind of encounter a question: is Chinese feminism a local practices of a global concept or national aspirations on a global stage? The United Nations World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995 is a landmark event through which China tried to 接轨, which is the Chinese term for like a connecting tracks. It's like literally like a train tracks connecting train tracks, because China was sort of like isolated from the rest of the international society in the past years. So this conference was used as an event, landmark event, to reconnect tracks with the international society. That was also when the national focus is shifted from 1980s modernization to 1990s globalization. Efforts were made to connect local Chinese feminisms with international feminism, and the latter is represented by US feminisms that are allegedly packaged by UN agenda. The global influences are mainly expressed in gender and development projects and the emergence of a largely international funded sector of feminist NGOs. In the 1990s, the Ford Foundation began supporting a range of participatory development training and research programs that focus primarily on Chinese rural women's health, poverty elevation, post-disaster reconstruction, and sustainable ecological development. Ford Foundation was one of the biggest donors to support Chinese NGOs in those years. Not only in the rural areas, but also in urban areas, including the anti-domestic violence NGO organization activities. Gender and development approach and agendas of NGOs are under scrutinization after the initial excitement and enthusiasm over gender and development in the 1990s wore off. For all that dedication, these programs had only limited success because they were not able to develop effective strategies for overcoming gender injustice, as well as economic and cultural injustice that rural women suffer. For instance, a close examination of the adoption of microcredit as a primary development strategy in China shows that microcredit programs were set up to empower women, but they in fact exacerbated local power imbalances. And all these NGO, most of these feminist NGO programs were kind of ended like after the 2008 finance crisis. Another aspect in the picture is the theoretical development of Chinese feminist scholarship. which is closely related to the concept of gender. The concept of gender was introduced to China along with the preparation of the UN World Conference on Women in 1995. The introduction of gender to China enlarges feminist work beyond a male-female biological binary to a broader inquiry into relationships of social power between the genders. So as we would assume the concept of gender to be, because we use it regularly here, but it was a very new concept to Chinese feminist academics back then. So people were very excited about it because they thought they found new tools. It signifies a discourse shift from men equality to gender equality. It's commonly accepted that the Chinese feminist concern is fundamentally with the relationship between women and the state. Some scholars doubt about the preeminence of women's liberation and state feminism in China. They question Marxist theory on several major fronts, particularly challenging the theoretical assumption that gender issues can be addressed by the socialist liberation that claims to end class struggles. As a result, the entry of the concept of gender into China is comparatively smooth, and gender soon became a dominant theoretical tool and a category of analysis used by feminist scholars. However, a small group of Chinese feminist scholars doubt the function of gender in Chinese feminist scholarship, which is called China's gender trouble. They argue that while the introduction of a gender advanced Chinese feminist scholarship, it interrupted an autonomous development of Chinese women's studies on its own. So as you could see, this is kind of like a tag war. At first, people were longing for something like a theoretical, then the concept of gender came in. Then some people found that maybe this is not something that could work for the Chinese society. And all this like a kind of a debates and arguments and contentions are like a partly related to Chinese socialist legacies. Criticisms of a social practice through the borrowed or the learned gender perspective is regarded as one of the most successful applications of Western feminist theory to the study of Chinese women. However, in the 1990s, facing globalization and landing of Western feminist theories, some of Chinese feminists seek indigenization of Chinese feminisms. They challenge the validity of such application by re-evaluating the Chinese women's liberation movement in the larger context of capitalized socialist practice and historical practice. So address how historical and social political contexts shape the rise and the development of women's studies, as well as the resulting characteristics and knowledge production in women's studies, in particular in a dynamic interplay of Chinese Marxism and feminism. In the 2010s, critical attempts were made among some Chinese scholars to re-examine the socialist legacy in relation to women's liberation and the roles of Western liberal feminisms in the study of Chinese women. One of their main concerns is that the landing of Western feminist theories is similar to theoretical colonialization. As you could tell, this kind of like argument and tension also reflect like somehow the relationship between US and China to a certain extent. Just as we think this is already very complicated, there's another piece to Chinese feminism, which is the feminist scholarship on Chinese cultural heritages. After all, Chinese history, culture has like a history that's 5,000 years. So there are traditions and cultural heritages also in play. The new movement in the early part of the 20th century departed from Confucianism, and a series of social, political, and cultural and political movements afterwards further dismantled the Confucian traditions. However, starting from early 20th, responding to gender issues, the question of Chinese women in Confucian traditions becomes how Confucian traditions should position themselves in the current feminist discourse. Although scholars in general agree that Confucianism is oppressive to women, some of them seek to prove that Confucianism is compatible with feminism. Social and political ideals in Chinese culture are primarily influenced by Confucian teachings, but Taoism and Buddhism also play a role. I think comparative feminist scholarship is a result of a transcultural experience because comparative scholars gain a transcultural perspective that was made possible by globalization. Myself is an example of that. So I came to the US to become a student and become a scholar, and that is my cultural experience through which I gained a transcultural perspective. Therefore, I'm able to give this presentation today here. So their experience and also my experience is transcultural, and their academic practice is transcultural, interpreting Chinese texts in a feminist way and comparing and connecting thought in different cultural and intellectual contexts. There's this diversity of a culturally Chinese feminism. Chinese feminisms are heterogeneous and changing. The diversity of Chinese feminisms are in terms of their positions to the governmental system, minority, ethnicity differences such as minority ethnicity feminisms, and identity difference such as LGBTQ plus feminism, and geographic differences. People talk about feminisms in Chinese-speaking regions such as Hong Kong and Taiwan, for example. So this is where I draw my conclusion. The purpose of my research project is to chart the intellectual development of Chinese feminist scholarship from mid-1990s onward in a philosophical way. I study Chinese feminist scholarship in the larger context of neoliberal global capitalism, explore its complex formation via theories and representations of Chinese feminisms, both in and beyond the boundary of China. My overall argument is that Chinese feminism is not a particularity or local expression of global feminism, international feminism, or transnational feminism, because inside the transnational flow, Chinese feminism still forwards its own preoccupations. My study of Chinese feminism shows that Chinese feminism has its own logic, trajectory, and development despite global influences. The value of studying Chinese feminist scholarship is not to enrich or diversify US-oriented international, global, or transnational feminisms, because that would further reinforce a US-centric power structure. Instead, my research is to show the boundaries of cultures is blurry, the entity of cultures is not fully closed, and the dialogues between cultures are invaluable. Dialogues means that it is not one direction influence, but exchanges of ideas. In addition to complete a monograph, the overall impact of this research program is that it will address new possibilities of understanding and dialoguing with feminisms in quote-unquote other countries and cultures. The question of what constitutes Chinese feminism is itself complicated, but my work illustrates that this is not something that is going on only in China. In other words, feminisms in other developing countries might face similar dilemmas problems and possibilities as Chinese feminisms have been encountering in the past 3 decades. In this sense, proposing a transcultural approach to study feminisms in global contexts might shed light on how, quote unquote, other feminisms are and have been in a descriptive sense, and what they should and can be in a normative sense. I'll stop my presentation here. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yuanfang. I am now going to go ahead and read questions as you have them for Yuanfang. We have a couple in the Q&A. Please, again, remember to go ahead and put them in the, you can either put your questions in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A, and then we'll kind of work our way through them that way. And we'll start with the first one in Q&A. That's from, I think, from Dick. Thanks for the informative talk. The question is there a characteristic way that drawing on cultural traditions bear on the relation to neoliberalism or the socialist legacy?
That's a really good question. I think my research on Chinese feminist scholarship, I think, is closely related to both. To be exact, it's closely related to the interplay between neoliberalism and Chinese traditions. And so if there were no the spreading neoliberalism, so to speak, then China would be pretty much like a keeps its tradition. But one couldn't really kind of imagine what it could have been if there wasn't this globalization or kind of like spreading of neoliberalism all over the world. So then maybe China would just kept its door closed. But then this is the reality we are facing now. So after the late 70s, especially after the 80s, and China was more closely integrated into the international society. Therefore, the development of the Chinese feminist scholarship is kind of closely related to the interplay of so-called local Chinese traditions and international, those like kind of economic development in the world. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Yuanfang. We have a second question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Are there high-level leaders around Xi Jinping who champion feminism? Are there any high-level women politicians?
I have no way about knowing the leaders' thoughts, but there are like a high-level women politicians. I think this is, to a certain extent, is about political representation. Like, so for at every level of like a political government, like there's supposed to be like a woman at every level, and so at the high level is no exception. They really want to show to people and the world that we are really gender equal society and we respect women, and so therefore they should have this representation at every level of the government.
Excellent, thank you. A third question from Margaret. I am so curious about what exactly you would propose as local Chinese feminisms. What are Chinese women's preoccupations as they relate to Western conceptualization of women's roles in culture and society?
So yeah, thank you for the questions. So local Chinese feminism, so means like, so to a large extent, like it means the socialist movement, that women's liberation in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So women were considered like as part of the proletariat class and liberated as with the poor, and therefore women were considered as equal partners as men. But in reality, that wasn't. I think in the 50s and 60s, I didn't live through those years, but from what I read, it was more like so claimingly like women were equal to men, and also that was a period of time that women's labor were considered very, very important. A large number of women were able to participate in workforce. So, and there are a lot of like government policies were made to make it possible. For example, when I was growing up, my parents' work units had like childcare units, so that parents could send their kids to these free childcare units so that they could focus on work. There are like, so it's really kind of a national endeavors to make sure that women were able to participate in workforce. But one could make an argument, would that really kind of dramatically increase women's stance in the society? But that's exactly why in the 80s, people started to question why. So we thought look, women were equal to men or the same as men. So this image of iron girls, because they thought that women were half the sky and as tough as guys. Therefore, they should be the same as men. But people started to emphasize femininity of women. Some scholars said, oh, for the first time in my life, I started to think I am a woman, so that I have like these characteristics of women. So this like kind of realization really made it possible for the 1990s change again. So to welcome this concept of gender, because before, even though people were thinking in a men, women kind of binary biological dualism, so it's not, they were not thinking much about the social roles of women. But the gender aspect really lent them a kind of a tool or lens to really look at, oh, there's a kind of social implications of being women. So this is like, so I in my presentation, I didn't spend much time on like a gender, but that was the most important like a development in Chinese feminist scholarship in the past 3 decades. A group of the Chinese US feminisms, American or Chinese, they kind of brought this concept to China, and it was welcomed and very with enthusiasm, and people really found something that's valuable and helpful. But of course, then you got kind of like into our argument, and but it's a complicated history. But in general, so this local Chinese feminism, like has its own like this socialist liberation tradition, and also the Chinese traditions like such as Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, etc., would have impact on the social norms and values and what is being cherished or not. And so, and with the mix of globalization and global capitalism, so it's a complicated picture. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
And folks, please feel free to follow up if you have questions or comments on anything Yuanfang has to say in response to the questions. The next question is this. I really loved your point that the evolving forms of feminist practice in China are by no means external import, but rather aspects of a process that is distinctively Chinese. I'd love to hear you sum up how you engage with the concept of something being distinctively Chinese. That is, how do you work with this concept while giving it meaning, but also not essentializing the Chinese experience?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It makes a lot of sense to me. I understand that essentialism is one of the concerns in feminist discussions. And in my previous book, I spent quite a bit of energy and time on talking about essentialism and how this feminist discussion about difference, like a difference critique to be feminist difference critique to be exact, it's not really the concern, but rather it's ethnocentrism is the concern. And so, but like, so to be more exact, to answer your question, like what is distinctively Chinese, if one claims, like, such as I claim this approach is or the development of pathways of Chinese feminisms is distinctively Chinese, am I claiming that there's some essence to it? I would say no, because it's just a really kind of I use this transcultural approach as a both a descriptive kind of approach and also a normative approach. And also this Chinese in the same sense is also like a descriptive and normative. So let me unpack this. It's like, so both transcultural and Chinese, distinctively Chinese, is a kind of like a description of what's going on, because Chinese feminism in the past 3 decades is like a kind of like was developed in a transcultural sense, but it's also in a very distinctive Chinese context. So in that sense, I think it's a kind of a description of what's going on and what has been going on. And also, I also talk about it being transcultural and Chinese in a normative way, because I think when we think about the possibilities and futures and of a development of a Chinese feminism, for example, and maybe also quote unquote other feminisms in other countries and cultures. So what they should be, I think, like in my limited experience and from my reading, like, so feminisms in other countries and cultures, like going through similar experiences, although in very different ways, of like interacting with the international feminisms and global feminisms. So in that sense, I think this transcultural feminism like opens new way, like new doors for us to look at this distinctively Chinese experience. And also this like a Chinese, something with the Chinese characteristics, also like a capitalist with the Chinese characteristics, or neoliberalism with the Chinese characteristics, is really kind of a very like distinctively Chinese way of describing its relationship with the world, like the influence from the global influences. On the one hand, it really wants to keep these Chinese characteristics, but at the same time admits that there are very strong international influences. I hope I addressed your concern.
Thank you, Yuanfang. We have a number of questions that have appeared in the queue. The first one, thanks for your talk. Can you talk about the recent Chinese women's status, given the recent headline news about women still suffering from human trafficking, and what policy implications are from the Chinese feminism studies? Has feminism studies been able to influence policymaking in China, and if so, how over the past decade since economic reform?
Oh, thank you so much for the question. So that's more like a kind of on the level of policy making. Yeah, there are like so it's complicated because the Chinese history and also politics has been, like economy has been changing in the past several decades. So at different stages of Chinese history, there are different policies. But I could give a few examples that these women feminist efforts were brought to be fruitful. For example, in the 60s, some women who were holding like a high level political positions were able to kind of promote like the marriage law to really kind of protect women's rights and put that into the writing into the official documents. But of course, one would see in the news, and there are lots of horrible instances about like violence against women. And I think like allegedly, the government, like China is a part of this, the documents that were signed after the 1995 women's conference, UN World Conference on Women. At the conference, Hillary Clinton, who was the first lady back then in 1995, made a speech. The title was "Women's Rights and Human Rights," and a series of documents, official documents, were signed among these countries in the United Nations to really fight violence against women, anti-violence against women, and also a lot of funds were donated to these organizations for such causes. But of course, the reality would be like, so it's maybe it's some things still going on, but in the recent years, there's also this more like informal feminisms, like in a performance sense. Probably you saw on the internet images, people like walk on the street to demonstrate that they use a kind of performance arts or like activities to really show that their concerns about gender inequality, especially about sexual harassment and etc. So that's kind of like Chinese academics started to talk about it, but not to a large extent. It's mostly in the informal sense, and people call it outer system sense. Outer system means it's not the governmental system, it's outer system. Therefore, it's because most academia, like in China, on the government payroll, but it's getting people's attention, and also people call it the Chinese version of Me Too movement, and especially on the internet, the younger generations, and they started to question. So all these concepts they were given is really meant to be like a gender equal. I hope I was able to kind of answer the question, because it's really complicated.
Thank you for your answer. We have 3 questions in the Q&A, and I think those are probably all we'll have time for. We'll go ahead and work our way through those. The first, how do you see the development of feminism in China under Xi Jinping? Whether Chinese tradition promotes feminism and at the same time hinders its development, especially in rural, backward areas. Do you think the gap between urban and rural feminism will get bigger in the future? Thank you again.
Wow, big questions. Thank you for the questions, though. Under the leadership, I don't really know what's going on under the leadership, but the Chinese traditions definitely were we used to kind of promote the idea of a harmonious society. So I was able to participate at several international conferences to talk about virtues and the Chinese traditions, like Confucianism, really about like respect your parents, for example, take care of the elderly. But this kind of the promotion of these ideas and the virtues go hand in hand with some kind of governmental ideologies, I would say. At a certain point, if like it really also goes hand in hand with the social welfare programs. Like if like the welfare programs, for example, retirement plans, like so don't have enough fund to support the elderly generation, then the younger generation were encouraged to take care of their parents. Plus that like a kind of a taking care of the elderly is like a kind of a rooted in the Chinese tradition. So people take it for granted that they should do that. So this like a harmonious society is one of the kind of slogans that Chinese government was promoting in the decades, and it's also like now these days. So for example, when I went to China last time, like so we lived in a gated community on the like a kind of the the walls outside of the gated community, there were like a kind of a posters about like kids washing feet for their parents, for example. It's almost everywhere. You could tell that this is really a virtue that they want to instill in people's mind and also behaviors. In terms of the traditions, like so in whether it hinders developments in rural backward areas. So I think that has to do with a urbanization process in China. So as we know that like a lot of like migrant workers who would leave their country, leave their homes and go work in the cities, and also bring their children there to get better education. Therefore, so their elderly parents who are left in the villages, so to speak, like empty nesters. And of course, so then the the villages are underdeveloped, but there's a huge like a kind of a trend of urbanization. For example, in my hometown, it was I grew up on the ocean, so it's a kind of years ago it was like a kind of like a tourist. It was a village for fishing, but now it became a really flourish like a tourist town, and so a lot of people became like a urban populations. So like the rural population was decreased. So you say like it's developed, yes, things and not developed, yes, at the same time. So, but with the encouragement of the government, there are more like a younger generation people who would go back to the country, really kind of work on the development. But I do think urban and rural feminism there's a gap and it's getting bigger, and I think it's also kind of corresponds to the rich and the poor and the social stratification and the kind of the development of one's financial situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 2 questions remaining. These are going to take us past the top of the hour, so I wanted to make sure to thank everybody for coming today. We really appreciate your time and your participation. I am very interested in your responses to these 2 questions, though, so we'll go ahead and work our way through these 2 questions and then call it a colloquium. How's that sound? Does that sound all right?
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay. The first one is from Christian. On the one hand, you seem to argue that the development of feminist theory depends upon social economic developments, such as globalized capitalism. On the other hand, you seem to agree with the claim that the Marxist paradigm of taking class as something that is more constitutive than sex or gender is exhausted. So, on the one hand, you seem to agree with the position that the socioeconomic development is in some sense prior to how it affects structurally the position of women in these developments. Now, given how capitalist China has become, shouldn't this lead to a heightened attention to class as something that is constitutive for capitalist socioeconomic formation itself? That is, not one identity among others.
Thank you, Christian. That's excellent question. I think like so I didn't really kind of address class in my presentation. And actually, when I was working on the book project, which I've been working on for like a couple of years. So class is one of the concepts that came up like in my not exactly in my reading, because very few people would want to talk about class. So this class concept like constantly kind of like interferes, so to speak, like it comes up in my thinking of all these feminist issues in China. So if you think about social economic development in Chinese society, then the class is not something that you can avoid talking about, or is something actually could be something that's really one of the major factors. And I think you really truly touched upon one of the key points of thinking about Chinese feminisms. And when we think about Chinese women, and so if we think about the differences among women, it's not that Chinese women is like a coherent group. We could call them us as a group, but at the same time, there are differences among Chinese women, obviously, and there's class differences. So there are different claims are being made about these different classes of women. For example, in the old time in the sense that like maybe pre-revolutionary years before 1945, most women stayed home, then they were able to join the workforce. Now in the 80s, they were encouraged to go back home. So it really depends on people's like a social and financial status, whether they had the privileges to stay home or not. So yes, I've copied your question. I'll think more about it, but I think you really touched upon a very, very important question. Thank you so much. That's inspirational to me.
And our last question from Megan. Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering about the politics of teaching about Chinese feminisms in a US context. As you mentioned, your research should not be understood as something merely meant to enrich US feminisms. But in my experience teaching in the US, it is very difficult for US students and academics and people in general to decenter themselves in this way. Do you have strategies for countering this in your work, or any thoughts on the challenges of doing your research in a US context?
Very excellent question. I have been teaching this course. It's a WS Women's Studies 403. The title is Women Changes in Developing Countries. The title itself is quite interesting, as if it assumed that women are changing in developing countries, and women in developed countries already finished the changing process. But anyhow, so while I was teaching that course, I was kind of having a similar question with you, but I ended up like teaching the course in a way that I started with the transnational, transcultural framework. Then all these so-called other feminisms in other countries really kind of illustration of that transnational approach, versus in a lot of textbooks, but probably not less so these days, like talking about US feminisms. Then at the end of the book, they say, oh, by the way, there are other feminisms in the world, as a caboose, like to really show the diversity of their discussion of feminism all over the world. I think like so. I think at one of the curriculum development meetings at Jensen, we had a couple of years ago, we had this discussion about whether we want to have like, the theory of intersectionality and transnational feminism as kind of the general framework, where we kind of design the curriculum and also a course. And I personally find it helpful. And this semester I'm teaching this course as well. So and the students who, like, at the beginning, we kind of started to just unfold this framework so that students would be able to know, like when they read, like for example, feminisms in Africa, they know like a kind of a general framework. It's not like under really the influence of US feminism. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dai. What an enlightening presentation. Really appreciate it, and your engagement with the questions, extraordinarily informative. Thanks again to Dr. Dai for your presentation, and to those of you who joined us today. We really appreciate your time, and we hope to see you again at future University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Take care and have a good weekend, everybody.